Jam den den jam be yong la sha sa lu kang ge lu de dim ye den ra nye da nam da ra sa la ve jin ye den ge ji jin sei che re ni je tu gra le bang zai gong dai si be zun re ma re men tam dung e je ze ve ro zo yi gong la Puji tarze yin lai chuju yung den song Rudare che do nyamu nye long Le je chak zhu zhon ze shen Mari mensre dungare nyugu Chinye chen ze ra je nam Dene ta yin sa ju tarze Yuen den lu zo jia se tu yu gu Chun cha chu dong chu ni jian zhe Da le me sen zhan bei yong lai du Amaraba zanade 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 Amma araba zanade amaraba zanade 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 amma araba zanade 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 Amar zanade 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 Araba zanade 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 Araba zanade amaraba zanade amaraba zanade 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 Araba zanade zedene je chera özreje dalu demo men barab salane Kadan denje jong lu tao ba ye lu zhe pop be nong wa ye zao du so Nam da zhu zhe me ser je sa ye den den zhe ba me zhe len ge ben zhe shirab nye de nong we che gen sa ra tom chon zhuo we la ma sha ge yu lu Jamya shana durje jin re se sa yin imbo dhava nam prasa nam ge nimbo shamba kundu zon nye we se chen jel ge sha tsarla senten po zhang jikbe ne cho tu jime tu je so le ma gen do pomo ren jin yung jen de ma yayam drama chel ge sha tsarla she je kana chin rab jin gura je zebe dong durje len la po Yarwe dan ba kun ne san ze be ge ju rinpo che la sha je wo cerap kun do si je dan ye le tam ge san mu sha ge yong zong xin shi nyen ge lam gen karma ba me je de be chi yu zu ge du Lasso te che number zo chu singing number so kane in yang tene chap sun ro ve sem tang song chup chu do sem je pa number ni sar tam ne tam be chu sin ro nang.
So to all of you who are attending the explanations wherever you are, please begin by recollecting the practice of taking refuge in the three jewels, as well as generating the body-mind. And with that as your basis, please listen attentively to the explanations.
Lasso chedang anzo thanda chedang matso we ngue de la yezen jambe yang la ngazo sowa chiteb nang gi yorwa sondeb chiche ta ti kor nge thagol mong bu shu ten ti ta ta la ngazo tanda zungha arapasa na desev yigen du sa gi yore te de yezen jambe yang tang Then show you Sanje Tamje Sinjalaban Hare Nan de la Duma Trugyore Duma Trugitanda de Parsing Trug Dunangiot Parsing to yes tembe gone Sauronang.
So at the outset of the teaching, Khenpo Rinpoche, and presumably those of you who know this prayer, recites the prayer to Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Now, Khenpo Rinpoche has given quite extensive explanations of the contents of this prayer at Dakpo Kagyeling. And perhaps for those of you who were not there at the time, you could perhaps obtain a transcript or a sound file of the explanations if you request that. Now, at the end of the prayer, the Manjushri mantra Arapat Sanati is recited, and this mantra is imbued with the spiritual influence of the Bodhisattva of wisdom Manjushri, as well as the Buddhas of the 10 directions, and it's made up of 6 syllables, and each of these syllables embodies one of the 6 paramitas. The actions enacted by enlightened individuals for the sake of others on their basis of the level of higher knowledge they have attained, which means that the 6 actions of generosity, ethics, and so on are ethics enacted on the basis of higher knowledge, which knows the true nature of all things. Hence, their actions designed to benefit beings are actions that transcend the ways of the world.
Yeah. Dagan Shinge Dilla Parsin took Jigme Lingpa Mare. Then so that
now, this perspective of the 6 syllables is not the one and only. There are many, many other perspectives as to the various workings of these syllables and what they embody.
And
there is, in specific, one text authored by the first Mipa, where he gives the details as to these many perspectives.
Last tene chen number solo ma shue chigla tene dontran dege Saturday da Sunday nikala shabe chose chune chuchig da she partu chotan de yore te thule charon nang.
Now the summer course, this course, has been extended with 2 days. So there will be sessions of teaching in the mornings of Saturday and Sunday between 10 and 11:30.
Te kari sana katsin technical problem chen nyimani she to ma song ti chap.
Simply because 2 days were cancelled earlier this week because of technological problems. So to make up for that, 2 extra days are added.
Lasso that ring tak karsa sakche thamche ne dung halwa wo sankente and that masho degi ore.
We continue with the explanations as to the second of the 4 seals, which concerns the statement by Buddha Shakyamuni, where he says that which makes for falling into worldly existences is of the nature of suffering.
That dinane nyalvege dungeda masona rorop chishu dijele yeda dungal ta masona rob che shutsarani.
Yesterday there were general explanations as to the different kinds of suffering experienced in hellish existences as well as in the land of Pretas.
That thanda nazo karishu tene tundu dungal tundu chiktinje kamje nesute ma shugi.
So today Khenpo Rinpoche will go on with explaining in general the various kinds of suffering experienced by those inhabiting the animal kingdom.
That tundu chiktin su nazo cheyate tangbo dagutawe namto sinchulo deche dela tenne nyampa tumu sheche wache tenne dochare o tendela tenne lesa leteke tenne tunduin jiktin tu nganso jewe nin sam yorgi yobare.
So in terms of a rebirth in the world of animals, there is, to begin with, the primary cause, the belief in a self, which is an object-oriented mindset which focuses on a real reality of the individual, thus perverting, as it were, reality. Perverting reality simply because the self isn't real, even though that is imagined. And in consequence of this figment of imagination, various afflictive, obscuring states of mind result. And in terms of the world of animals, the most predominant afflictive, obscuring state of mind is that of ignorance. However, there is quite a level of desire as well. So the most common afflictive, obscuring states of mind among animals are those of ignorance and desire. And because of their presence, the being, in this case animals, these afflictive obscuring states trigger actions in consequence of which the animal accumulates karma. A mindset a mindset colored primarily by those two afflictive obscuring states, accompanied by the notion of a self, as well as actions of the past enacted on the basis of those states, will bring about or result in the rebirth of an animal.
Tendeche yonde ta tundro thela mi dago japchabe tundro ta dago majabe tundro te rigni yonde gyore.
Now, in terms of the world of animals, you can categorize them into two basic groups. Animals that have been domesticated by humans, as well as animals that are kept as pets, and wild animals, animals living in the wild.
Tate mege dago japchabe tenzole yina yang dungal number sopachi yonge yobate nganzo seburo.
And in terms of, in specific, domesticated animals, it should be obvious to anyone that those animals suffer greatly in various ways because of being domesticated and made to do labor for humans.
Yin kana yasam tangumare drinkazan yakab jigi yenang la sha tang pakweche de semjen den zo teng ro de semjin jig ger jig zek chen dunge kase do ten zo
Well, particularly during this period, this should be quite evident in terms of animals who've been caught in the wild by human beings, and those human beings then trading their flesh, their skin, their horns, and so on for profit. If one looks at, for example, so-called wet markets, markets where the animals that have been caught in the wild are caged and stacked. One cage is stacked upon the one below, and so on and so forth, and there is just very little space for the animal to be able to move even, and the animal is kept in horrific circumstances till it's sold, at which point it's slaughtered on the spot. So this is an example which goes to show just to what extent some animals are subject to suffering because of human beings.
Taganashin mi dakum majab tundu girik tele samatana. Tene mi se on be dunge yore korang so chig sawe dungal khase yung do.
Now, if one looks at animals living in the wild, they live in constant fear because of hunters, again human beings, hunting down animals for various reasons, as well as fears of being killed by another animal, a predator.
Tente chen pen ngi song sum ge dunge la shepcha chen ngan so lo jong nang ne sam no si tang nang da tan da ngan so mi ge ten chen la rang to che ye be kam de la de hak dun to dan be chue dang che be kam de la.
Lasso?
Ngan su chu ji drum ma tup du se de chola ji shoro yin na tan ngan zo ni so ne me che den kar yo.
Now, one should give careful thought to the various kinds of suffering that those in the three lower existences go through. And perhaps it will become clear to one that one's present rebirth as a human being is one of good circumstances. In particular, for those who have met with the Buddha Dharma. Human beings do have a bit of an opportunity to manipulate the course of events that occur during their lifetime. There is the possibility for humans to make choices. However, of course, it's up to the humans who have this opportunity to make the right or the wrong choice. That's a completely different topic. Point made is that there is some room for maneuvering, which animals and those in the land of pretas and those in hellish existences simply do not have. As a human being, one has a bit of a room for maneuvering. And in the case of someone who's met with the Buddha Dharma and who doesn't do much with what he obtains in the context of teachings, meditation practice, contemplation and the like, the opportunity at hand is wasted. And one should ask oneself, do I really have any sort of guarantee that I, in my next rebirth, won't be reborn in any of the lower existences? And one would find such a guarantee is nowhere to be found. Realizing this could serve as an inspiration and trigger diligence to the extent where one engages in the practices of the path and does not just waste the opportunity at hand.
Tendegi sulla sonna tangne. Tangara su namba sanjebe. Chugur shukbatso. Rapsuna. Tarvatop to be a gravation kore.
Now, a practitioner of the Buddhist path needs to make a choice, and each individual will make his choice as to the extent of him making use of what he has obtained in terms of teachings, instructions, and the like. Now, a determined practitioner would take the decision to do whatever it takes for the sake of attaining liberation by way of devoting himself to the practices of the path in this life.
다지 망부지 농상 윤킨레 레가 윤킨레 텐제게 첸디 텐도 타르바도 탐제신 bellam지 톱네 트베게 더나 좀 마tum나야 테네 제와 제만 암소 Nisson sumna jemme göbek. Chetu penna kuncho sumla Tüdang nekap kundo japsun robe semsung. Tene sambas sangpoche tigene yena pembe shawa gan tutupchi drup sik te lakdun tu mikgewa chupung tubek ta zunduchi ngebar nangore samto tende nangbayina remje 제와트 종루 로네 타르바 톱투 뒤지 체그리
So for those who have entered the Buddhist path, it's important to think in those terms. Now, if one is a Buddhist practitioner who, for various reasons, being in the midst of a professional career, having a family and the like, and therefore one's lifestyle, if one maintains that lifestyle, doesn't give one the time needed so that one can make the efforts necessary in order to be able to attain liberation from rebirth in worldly existences. So if that is the situation, then the Buddhist practitioner should devote as much time as he can, that his situation permits him to devote to the practice of the Buddhist path, for the sake of at least a good rebirth in his next life, as well as future good rebirths. And with good rebirth is meant a rebirth where one again meets with the Buddha Dharma and can continue one's efforts on the path to enlightenment, thus also saving oneself from an unfortunate rebirth in any of the three lower existences. And for the sake of accomplishing this, one needs to at all times take the three jewels as one's objects of reference, as it were. One takes refuge in them, knowing fully well that it's the three, by way of the three jewels, that progress can be made. In addition to which, one should foster a good mindset, that is to say, a mindset of kindness and compassion, and one should, whenever possible and according to one's capacity, enact deeds by way of which others are benefited, as well as diligently engaging in efforts by way of which one relinquishes engaging in any of the 10 non-virtuous actions. This is exceedingly important in terms of obtaining a future rebirth of good circumstances permitting the continuation of the Buddhist path. It's indispensable in terms of accomplishing that the 10 non-virtuous actions are relinquished. Now, if what was listed here is done, then that would secure, as it were, a good rebirth in one's next life, where one can continue to develop and therefore secure future good rebirths, and at one point in the distant future, the result is the attaining of liberation from rebirth in worldly existences.
Perna loben lutu bisong pare. Nanso nangwan nangwe tartulun rogre song.
Nganso kandre?
Nanso tanda mi lutin top lutin zangboch top yorwa. Tandi zangbo top ande zangbo ne zangwe zangru tane tar zangbo tarshimba chegore mato zangbo ne nyambara pamandu song.
The well-known Indian Buddhist master of old, Nagarjuna, said, at the time where a free and well-favored human rebirth has been obtained, one should make good use of it, so that in one's future rebirths, the level of good circumstances in terms of making progress on the path to enlightenment are secured, and in a future lifetime, therefore, one does attain liberation from rebirth in worldly existences. This is how one makes use of this, the present opportunity. Nagarjuna said, one should not engage in actions which would result in the opposite, namely that one in one's next rebirth and future rebirths removes oneself farther and farther away from the possibility of ever attaining liberation from rebirth in worldly existences. This is what one should absolutely not under any circumstances do when one has this opportunity.
Penna tandang shuye ki labja tenzo yin yang. Drum mitube ki labja zan mare.
Now, the advice Khenpo Rinpoche just gave can be applied by anyone. It isn't beyond anyone to do the things that were listed in terms of taking refuge in the three jewels, foster a good mindset, benefiting others according to one's capacity, and the relinquishing of the 10 non-virtuous actions. This anyone can do. What's the difficulty in taking refuge in the three jewels, if any? And what would the problem be in treating others kindly? How difficult can it be? It wouldn't be very difficult at all. It's just a matter of being kind. Now, if the opposite happens, namely that kindness is not at hand, the opposite is at hand, both the unkind person and those subjected to unkind actions by that person are unhappy. So both the unkind person himself and those he interacts with would all be unhappy. One can just take the simple example of being kind to an animal. The animal immediately responds with unconditional love. So what would the difficulty be in being kind? If one looks at it properly, there would be no difficulty in fostering kindness.
Chitila sambat nakpoche, then jorwa tsuboche, chitigan Koran tenju to sort it, so sorting, cooking to lane ogdoa.
Now, if we continue with the example of relating to an animal, being kind to the animal gives the animal's response of unconditional love, whereas if we take the example of a dog, if you kick a dog, the dog will respond with growling and showing his teeth. So the response you get from others depends upon the way you treated them.
Chitele samba sang bache pinch to the kolam sang al suyam chikdo. Tinto, Nanzona, cancer, Samba Sangu, Gene, Rang Nupatan, Yin La Pintage, Nanzokala Kabokan, Yomade.
In fact, it shouldn't be difficult at all for anyone to be kind to others. One will always get a good response, so what would the problem be in being kind to others? Really, there is no difficulty in that.
Then Miguel Chu, Bangye said the young Zazab Chena,
and in terms of relinquishing the 10 non-virtuous actions as to one's behavior, if one is attentive in terms of how one acts, that shouldn't be a problem either. If one pays attention to how one acts, one would immediately see if one is about to engage in any of the non-virtuous actions. And seeing that, one can stop oneself before it happens. It's not a difficult thing to do. It's not beyond anyone. So, in terms of explaining about the different kinds of suffering found in the lower existences, one should be clear as to that the purpose of doing so is not to instill fear in the people who are given the explanations. Digi gela.
Nganzo tiran Roma goes, di dungeta.
Digi ma la chi sung sung.
De hakone, nganzo ngisung sum la Roma goes.
It is simply about giving the information about the facts of those existences in order to inspire one to make the efforts whereby one will not need to take such an unfortunate rebirth. And it should also be clear by now that the reason for those in the lower existences, the reason for them suffering the way they suffer, the source of it all is their own personal actions. This was not engineered by others. It's not some sort of punishment for whatever imagined crime. It's simply something one has brought upon oneself.
No lasso ta
And in terms of the length of lifespans of animals, there is a wide range of the length of the lifespan of various species. Next, in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, Gampopa explains about different types of suffering in higher existences. Suffering in the world of humans, suffering in the world of so-called demigods, and suffering in the world of gods.
Tan denzo de bana thori ki tenchen denzo de jena dungal chan mebar ve sna mare kol
So suffering is at hand in higher existences as well. So if we begin by looking at the world of humans,
대단 relevant sakje gewasak palatene mi lusu jewalin tugyor.
So if we look at the world of humans, the reason for rebirth here is, to begin with, the notion of a self, which perverts one's worldview, in that one upholds a belief of something which simply isn't there. However, that's what we all do. And in conjunction with that belief, there are the enacting of, and now we're looking at what triggers rebirth as a human, the enacting of virtuous actions enacted on the basis of afflictive obscuring states. So it's virtuous actions tainted by the workings of the worldly mindset. And those virtuous actions, in conjunction with the belief in a self, are what make for rebirth as a human being.
Sakje gewalatene mi lu lintware mi tinchin la mi rikashe tam mi mesetel yang sakje gewe phongson yin chang mese jirtang gi chane jibuchi je tukgen de yore kashe mi tinchin la yang kangam mongbo che dengen denzo
now, if we start to look at more details here, in general, it's worldly virtue that's responsible for this kind of rebirth as a human being. However, if one starts to look at the various circumstances of different groups of human beings, one will find that in some cases where it's virtue and virtue alone which has triggered the rebirth as a human being, that human being will live his life in good circumstances. Then there are human beings who live their lives in very difficult circumstances, poverty, warfare, and the like. And here you have, in terms of what caused those circumstances, a mix of virtue and non-virtue. It's because of the additional feature of non-virtue that the circumstances as a human being aren't that good. However, if one were to sum up the different types of suffering, the basic types of suffering in the world of human beings, you end up with 8 types. Gava. Dishin to Kiva. Diketo.
Nganjukin doles. Gao nganjukin doin nang tu. Kiwate Rajing Dunhala re songte. Tegan Shinge Jewate Dungal che. Gapate young Rajing Dungal res. Nawate young Dungal re. Chiwate young Dungal re. Tande Milune Chan and the Chuni de Yuedeverwa.
Now there is a sutra. And a sutra, as has been explained, is a lecture given by Buddha Shakyamuni that has later been recorded in writing. And there is a lecture requested by a disciple in the context of the details of rebirth, conception, and what happens thereafter. And it's recorded that here the Buddha explained the following in terms of types of suffering in the world of human beings. There are, to begin with, 4 basic events in the life of a human being that are in and of themselves suffering and that can cause or that do cause further suffering. These are birth, aging, disease and death.
Tejendo doinandun desongdoa Dukpa Tang Chalvayon Dungal res.
Next, the Buddha said, during the lifetime of a human being, the human being will suffer frequently or just occasionally, depending upon the nature of his previous actions, because of losing that which is pleasant, that which is about a good circumstance. So the loss of a good circumstance, whatever the circumstance may be, results in suffering.
Then
the Buddha continued, there is suffering because of encountering that which is unwanted. And there is also the suffering of making a lot of efforts with the aim of obtaining that which one desires, but failing to do so. Next, the Buddha explained there is suffering because of what is involved in safeguarding what one has accumulated, what one has obtained. So, in general, these 8 types of suffering are common in the world of human beings. Now, the source of them occurring all together is birth. birth into the worldly existence of human beings. It all begins with birth. So, in terms of sentient beings at large, not just human beings, and the circumstances of birth, some sentient beings are born from a womb, some an egg, etc., etc. There are various kinds of birth in terms of the physical birth itself. However, human beings are beings born from a womb. Tini?
Tate kandesin jegiresina. Tatangbo pardu namshete pardu sipana neve semjentela lech topke junturdan dambari.
Lasso?
Tene kole lai migge ngambarshepate yore. Te yonte ko korangi jenede tongyongyorta.
So we'll go back to the phase between death and a new rebirth prior to conception, where the mind has lost the physical body of the previous birth, and therefore what is at hand is simply a very subtle mental body. And it's in the circumstance of, therefore, as was explained the other day, when thinking of a person, finding himself next to the person instantly, and when thinking of a place, finding himself in that place instantly, he also knows the thoughts of others, and his clairvoyance is at a level where he at one point becomes aware of his next rebirth, even though conception has not yet occurred. In consequence of the nature of the mental body at hand, this is how that mental body operates, how it works simply, and it's uncharted territory for the deceased individual, who is not at all used to be able to know what others think, good or bad, nor used to instantly finding himself in a place he just thought of. It's all quite a terrifying situation.
Onlaso te chete ta te thong yoma tha do ta pardu semchen de la
Keva kawa lengi
gaba thong ma thong tha do korang da shinchu lo nwa ye singi ji yong.
Now this mental body, when the point of knowing the next rebirth happens, surfaces in his mind, that produces 4 ways of thinking, as it were, that pervert reality. So 4 deluded ways of thinking, 4 ways of seeing himself and his surroundings happen, ways which do not accord with the facts. So there is the impression of a storm-like wind blowing.
And
at other times, this mental body has the impression of finding himself in the midst of a very heavy rainfall. And at times he has the impression that the sun has set altogether forever, and there is just the impression of being trapped in a dark area, or in an area of darkness. And at times he has the impression of being in the midst of large crowds that are very loud and rowdy. At which point the urge of leaving the situation, escaping the situation happens. Now that drives him towards conception, and in the case of a mental body with good predispositions of virtue, the impression of a large mansion happens, and the mental body is drawn to that large palace-like mansion, which indicates, though the mind in this, or the mental body in this situation, is not aware of that, perhaps, but it indicates, this impression indicates rebirth as a god. Kampa nangla yupache.
Nangla yupache.
Tene di
kense geni yan jan.
Toksa
gongma lan roata. Tene na yang ta desa pichi uchi na deva. Tende no shane te ngan zundu yor.
Da di kompa yapo de da sala keve ta.
Ta re.
Ja.
Tene tanda de. Mi du den pensum sopar jevta.
Whereas an individual whose predispositions will bring about rebirth as a human being would find himself within a nice building where he climbs stairs, walking up towards the higher floors. And having arrived at the top floor, there is a very pleasant area where he settles down, a pleasant home where he settles down, and that then indicates rebirth as a human being.
Teniya ta Jewel yena Quran no kan shar gi yorsana.
Dring sena mi
Jewel Tene za ge zhe sha we kong ba yin je wo ji nan zun ro chi. Kong ba chun jung ji nan. Yeah.
So that indicates a rebirth as a human being in very good circumstances. Then there are others who will also take rebirth as a human being, and if we sort of divide their situation in terms of the circumstances, so medium good circumstances, there the mental body sees a very small but nicely made dwelling made of natural material such as grass and the like, which he enters, and that impression indicates rebirth as a human being in medium level good circumstances. Another example would be a small house made of wood, and entering there would indicate the same. Whereas someone destined for rebirth as a human, but in poor circumstances, would enter or would have the experience of entering a large forest or becoming trapped within the walls of a building. So these appearances, as it were, these manifestations, when these manifestations happen and the mental body enters whatever the manifestation is, that's when conception happens.
Tene tangal to shune tene dawa godan shapuchu dawachi mepal chawala tenrugi.
And most individuals, in terms of the time frame of being in the womb of the mother, that would cover approximately, for the majority, 9 months and 10 days. However, there are variations. It's not as if each and every human being spent exactly that amount of time in the womb of his mother. Now, while in the womb of the mother, there are also numerous types of suffering experienced by the future child. As well as in connection with birth itself. There are descriptions in the Jewel Ornament, which you could read about. Then there is the sutra mentioned earlier, which was requested by by a younger brother of Buddha Shakyamuni. There are many details in that sutra as well, and you could probably find some translation of it.
Yet you don't know Jundu things.
There is the 84,000 reading room, and as far as Khenpo Rinpoche knows, you would find a translation of that sutra there.
This song's Jewani Dunghal, Sidata Jewala Dungat and the Songad.
So there are detailed descriptions as to the various types of suffering while in the womb and at birth.
Tene, that Gepani Dunghal Sondoa. Gep Nanjugandono, Song Mindu. Gawayan Dunghalwa Yeno Sondoa.
Larry. Then there is suffering in the context of aging.
That Gondo Chonga Shida Gochu Jumarete. Ya Loche and the Lamsa Sorunye Chindoa.
Now, younger individuals are usually quite oblivious to the kinds of suffering that happen during old age. It's usually very, not intentionally, but it's difficult for younger people to get a grip on this because they have no personal experience of it. As for the rest, those who are older, it's quite easy to understand. It's knowledge based in experience is quite different from simple intellectual knowledge lacking a personal experience of whatever is at hand. And Khenpo Rinpoche takes himself as an example, saying, till he reached the age he's reached, he of course recognized that there would be suffering because of this and that happening during old age, but as he at the time had no personal experience of it, he really didn't truly comprehend what the suffering at hand is about. Once you've passed 60 years of age, things start changing, and both because of previous life experience and now a more personal experience of what is explained, one's knowledge of this type of suffering is rather more comprehensive than previously.
Class get go to Jubjunga like a lay Jana Chicale Kavin home at the Shargamento.
Class Katse?
Class get go.
Now, Khenpo Rinpoche taught extensively at the Nalanda Buddhist Institute for Higher Buddhist Studies at Rumtek Monastery during quite a few years earlier, when he was much younger, sort of 30, 40. And in those days, he had no problem whatsoever in giving 7 or 8 lectures a day, which he had to do because there was a lack of other lecturers. for longer periods, he would be the only one, and who would therefore have to give lectures that many times a day.
Then lo tukju nan yalem de then durun rogndo kala kacheru chir class chigni ting yalen kala yo chang do.
However, now as he's beyond 60 years of age, things are quite different. It's quite an effort to do just 2 lectures a day, and depending upon the health circumstances, sometimes even 1 lecture a day is quite hard. Now, in the Jewel Ornament, the author Gampopa lists 10 major types of suffering regarding old age.
Tan denzo dungal chubo de kanga tan aranzo riri ware di nane kana kanzam rona soso de nywa yore te gengo riri ware tenzo zichana de la shepra shu de gosamare.
And Khenpo Rinpoche says you can read the description in the Jewel Ornament, and for those who have reached a higher age, it would be very easy to relate to these descriptions, and others can then read the descriptions of these 10 types of suffering in relation to old age for the sake of learning about what old age is about in terms of suffering.
Give it dunkals. All so tea into tade chena betarjin te ma loro nang teni yang tanda Jigme Lingpa song ti na la yang halam de so chikpa chikcha songsha di nika khung tuksa tajin shushure gao ngan ju gundola khung tu nando.
So please read the descriptions of these various types of suffering in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, as well as in the Treasury of Precious Qualities, authored by Jigme Lingpa. They are very similar, the descriptions of both, and both descriptions originate with what the Buddha said in this sutra requested by his younger brother.
Then we
have different types of suffering in terms of disease.
Operation
now, suffering because of disease is something most people know of to some extent. Because of certain diseases, there might be a great deal of pain. One may need surgery, and healing afterwards will involve a period of recuperating, and there will also be quite a bit of physical pain. Then there may be pain because of ineffective medication, and even because of medication that did not agree with one's body, and therefore pain and suffering. The list is rather endless of different types of pain possible in terms of disease.
Ten tagana shinge kala sande to teyan sa chugumarwa ya.
Also, one very often, in terms of certain diseases, has to be on a specific diet. One can no longer eat what one would like to eat, and so on.
Tene ta European dawchina longba ya ku songza insurance yore ma to longba yenda le tende yo mare ta mincho ton dun rosong tong mutup dunge shirandwa.
Now on the European continent, more or less everyone is covered by a medical insurance, so medical treatment is available to the majority of people here. However, there are many parts of the world where people can't afford medical attention, where universal medical insurance simply isn't at hand, and therefore in many parts of the world people suffer greatly and die because they have no access at all to medical care. So pain and suffering in the context of disease can be quite excruciating.
Penna pechen shubina darin remne chakon de yong kabla Nepal ke tongse mangbo ne mi jasha mangbo minkan roya pesha me ten rame che chunu phando zasong chen.
In the context of this pandemic, if we take the example of Nepal, where the majority of the population is pretty poor, very poor one would say. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And as of now, there are reports of hundreds and hundreds of villagers who have been infected by COVID-19 and who have no access whatsoever to any kind of medical attention. They simply resort to suicide. Hundreds and hundreds of poor people resort to suicide in the face of having become infected by COVID-19, knowing that their family members and their fellow villagers will probably not survive anyway.
Ten tagana shinge pana jana galongbal chashana ten nende tongbon jonsa uhandra wachil chashana communism member minkin so menkan the dumetu de tan goje tra so jotre ten dugode tat che shinkin che nga langin che nga menkan zu chana de sho se and tende ke che go chondwa.
And if we look at China, where the pandemic struck first, particularly in the region where we find the large city of Wuhan, it's again not evident that everyone affected by the virus would have access to medical attention. In fact, there is the system of prioritizing members of the Communist Party, and in the case of those who are not members, and membership is something you earn, it's not something you can apply for and just become a member. So if you're not the type of person who has earned membership, then you would, in the case of a hospital being full, be turned away, and the available beds would be given to members of the Communist Party. So it's a matter of life and death for some people, in terms of having access to medical attention, in terms of chances of surviving the virus.
Today into Penna,
and the disease itself, namely this infection of COVID-19, the course of the disease is exceedingly painful for many who've been infected.
European mumba that's all that insurance yore the yevala gawagam to bachita to namdayan the dag soul song but manyam begging around some of the kechambur lomban.
So if we consider our part of the world, the European continent, where the majority have access to universal medical attention, one should really rejoice in the fact of this. And pray that this good norm, as it were, on our continent will be upheld in the future as well.
And
one should also cultivate aspirations and make prayers towards the end that universal medical attention be available to everyone throughout the world, in regions where individuals now not have access to medical attention.
So
that's all for today.
Sonam Daya, Tamje Zagbanye, Tomne, Nebe, Danam Pamje, Jaganaje, Balau Truwa, Sigbe, Solan, Roll Water.